You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined again by Yonah Freemark for the annual Prediction Show. Yonah chats with us about his new job at the Urban Institute, projects added to his transit inventory, and we make predictions about the upcoming infrastructure bill. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do it without you. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and I'll send some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves with dedicated lane designs. And finally, every donation will have access to bonus features, including podcast extras that might not fit in the original cut. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Well, Yonah Freemark, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, glad you're back. This is your 9th visit to the show in the last 7 years. We're excited to have you here as always. I wanted to ask, how are things going? How's the pandemic treating you?
I'm doing fine as far as these things can go. I'm living in Washington, D.C., so I've been through quite a roller coaster in terms of public events. But right now, today was a beautiful 70-degree day, and I have nothing to complain about.
That's good. That's good. What got you to move to Washington, D.C.? So we had you on at the end of the election night extravaganza, so folks might know about your new job. But if folks didn't listen to that, what's your new gig?
So I moved to Washington after the completion of my PhD, and I'm now a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a 50-year-old nonprofit organization that does research on a whole variety of topics like healthcare, justice, the economy, tax policy, etc. But one of the main areas of interest, and actually the original area of interest for the organization, is metropolitan policy. So I'm part of the Metropolitan Policy Center at Urban Institute, and I do work on housing, land use, and transportation research. So that's what I'm doing here. And it's been quite an exciting last few months just getting to know the place.
That's awesome. I knew of the Urban Institute. They do a lot of research. There's a lot of stuff. What have you found out about the organization that you didn't quite know before?
Well, it has this really interesting history, which is that it was founded sort of in association with the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which, as many people know, occurred in the late 1960s under President Lyndon Johnson. And the idea of the Urban Institute was to create a sort of nonpartisan, non-governmental organization that would be able to study the effectiveness of HUD's programs. And so right now, our headquarters is actually located directly adjacent to the HUD building. Of course, nobody's in the office right now, but we're located right next to it. And the idea is really to be able to bring insight into how public policies are working. Of course, not all the work that we do is at the federal level, but the federal level is, of course, very important.
And so last time also we talked to you, you were a bit nervous about the election. How are you feeling now?
Well, to put my personal hat on, I am. I believe that the American, people have made their choice, and I'm happy to see, there's been quite a bit of progress in the last few months, and certainly in Washington, there's a lot less security and concern about protests. I think one thing that was interesting is that during the sort of Capitol incursion that occurred soon after the election in January, people may not know this, but downtown Washington was like entirely boarded up. There were tanks. You couldn't even go into certain areas downtown. It was honestly pretty depressing as somebody who lives in DC. It sort of magnified all the problems with the coronavirus of just empty neighborhoods, people not, going to work, things of that sort. And I think it's been great to see over the last few months, the city sort of coming back to normal, the boards being taken off the Walgreens, more people walking around. And I'm hoping that, as people get vaccinated and life moves on, we can all sort of go back to enjoying our city again. But there's still areas of DC that are closed off. I mean, Lafayette Park in front of the White House, I was just there this weekend and it's still closed off. So
Mm,
there's more
mm.
work to be done.
On a brighter note, when are the cherry blossoms coming out?
Oh, I think they're in April, but yeah, I've never seen them. I'm really excited, but I have this fear that they're going to actually not have it happen as an event because they're afraid of too many people going.
Mm.
So I'll have to visit sort of, I don't know, on an early morning weekday or something.
Yeah, something when there's not too many people, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, so I wanted to talk to you as we do every year about our predictions from last year and the year before. We'll get to that a little bit later. But, the kind of the impetus for this in episode 6, one of their first episodes, now we're at, 320 something, is to talk about your actual annual report on openings and construction. When did you start this post on the Transport Politic? And how's the process evolved over the last, I guess it's been 13 years or so?
Yeah, well, I think a little less than that. I started it in 2009 was the first one that I did with the idea that there wasn't a good sort of directory of the different projects happening around the country. It's been useful to continue this sort of annual effort because of the fact that I think there's a lot of interest out there in seeing the investment in our transit systems. And this sort of gives me the opportunity to delve into all the different projects that are happening everywhere. And I think there are a few things that I've noticed in doing this over the last few years. One is that doing it annually is not enough, which is why I created a sort of subset website, Transit Explorer, where I try to keep it as updated as possible at all times with all the different projects, mapped out with all the data I have and, including outside of the United States now, because I think there's an interest in tracking this data constantly, not just on an annual basis. But the other thing I've noticed is that a lot of projects that, we were hopeful about a decade ago are still under construction. And it's an interesting sort of reality check, the pace of construction for these efforts that are quite monumental. I mean, back 10 years ago, we were talking about the Honolulu Rail project getting completed soon, the Long Island Railroad East Side Access project getting done soon. And those both are still not done. Hopefully they're going to open soon, but it is remarkable the degree to which we are just not that good at coming up with realistic estimates of when projects are going to be completed and how much they're going to cost. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this overall about how, a lot of construction projects, especially in the United States, are too expensive. And there's some truth to that, absolutely. But I think the bigger issue is we just don't have a good sense of how to make an estimate or how these gigantic projects will be done and how they'll be done on time and on budget. It's just, we're still obviously not that great at it.
I mean, there's a number of efforts of folks trying to calculate costs and try to compare them between projects. I mean, is there another effort needed to go through this estimation calculus and figure out, where people went wrong with the estimations? I mean, I agree with you. I feel like looking at your list, it looks like a New Start's report from about 15 years ago that
Yeah.
sticks out in my head. I'm like, what, Mid-Coast Corridor? I thought we were done with that. So it's interesting to see that. And do we need that? Do we need that next level of research? And what would that take?
There's this scholar, this European scholar named Bent Flybayer, who has been writing about mega projects and how they sort of inherently.
Is that how you say his name? I always thought it was Flyberg.
I believe according to my old professor, Larry Vale at MIT, his name is pronounced Flybayer. So.
Okay, I learned something new every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is my old professor's statement, so if I'm wrong, blame him, not me.
I know who you're talking about. I think folks will know who you're talking about because he's prolific about this subject.
Yeah, he's prolific, and there's something sort of human about wanting to create estimates that seem reasonable, but that somehow always go off track. I'm not sure this is a universal case, but it's certainly something you see not just in the United States, but the projects I follow in the UK and France follow similar lengthening out of project delivery timelines. I mean, give you an example, Crossrail, the big new subway under London, has supposed to be, it's been years that it was supposed to open.
Right.
It's just like year after year it's delayed. It's not clear to me how we resolve this problem. But yes, I agree. It's more than just cost. It's also about creating reasonable estimates.
Yeah, and that's interesting. You talk about international examples. I mean, you started adding international examples to the Transit Explorer. When did you start thinking, okay, I need to expand this outside of North America?
The first time I did it, it was just in the United States.
Hmm.
And the immediate critique came in that I wasn't including Canada. So I included Canada. And then the critique came in that I wasn't including Mexico. So I started including Mexico. And then it sort of continued from that point. I mean, at a certain point, we're reaching a limit in terms of what I'm capable of doing personally as a sort of hobby, because this is just a one man effort.
When are you going to do China? I mean, come on.
Maybe when maybe when I retire, Jeff, at my current rate.
Yeah, I mean, it does take a lot of work. I am very impressed with the amount of effort that you've put into this, and every year updating everything. It must be a fair amount of work. And also, I noticed that you've also started selling the shapefile as well
Yeah.
in order to kind of recoup, I imagine, a few costs.
Well, yeah. I mean, so right now I allow people to buy the data for their personal use at a pretty low cost. And the reason why I sell it, don't give it away, is that I have to pay for the web hosting. I have to work with my collaborator, Stephen Vance, who basically runs all the coding underneath the website. I have to pay for that out of my own pocket. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm charging. It's not because I'm like demanding, that people give me a big profit
Oh
here.
no, I no. I mean that's the thing is like when we created the TOD database, when CNT created that and I helped with some of that data analysis and GIS, I mean, we used to give some of that away for free, but I imagined at some point, it just because the back end of it is so expensive. And I don't
Yeah.
I don't know if people actually understand how much websites actually cost. I mean, not everything's Squarespace, right? And even that costs money for some folks to pay a little bit monthly fee. So, this stuff's not cheap.
So my friend Stephen Vance, who I collaborate with for our website, runs his own website called Chicago Cityscape, which is this amazing property level database tool that you can use to understand property transactions in Chicago. And it's bespoke. He created it himself, and he sort of runs it mostly himself. But underneath that website and Transit Explorer are these, his amazing coding and all these sort of processes that I'm not even sure how they run, but they require a lot of web servers and a lot of, frankly, costs on our end to make sure that we can pay for those servers. So yeah. But I think the broader point here is that, I've actually been surprised by the interest in the data. I've probably sold it like 100 times at this point or something like that. There is this interest in getting up to date transit information by scholars, by people who are just sort of interested in transit and care about it and want to learn more about it, and by a few, companies that want to sell things around those. I'm excited about that because what it suggests to me is that like transit continues to be this really interesting and important element of our society, and people want more information about it. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interest. I mean, from researchers specifically, I feel like we got a lot of interest from that because people wanted to look at the totality of
Mhm.
transit expansion and what it meant for TOD and all that stuff. So if you can do that in GIS and then start to do the analysis using census data and stuff like that, that's something that people really were into. So I can imagine that continuing as researchers keep wanting to
Yeah.
look at that data. Let's get into the report. I mean, we can't go through every line because obviously that's just insane. There's so much stuff happening, which is amazing that you can keep up with all this. But do you have, like, I think I ask you each year, I think I ask you if you have favorites, if there's any ones that stuck out to you from the expansions or even from the openings. We'll get into what we predicted last year, but anything stick out to you this year while you're going through and looking for lines?
As I mentioned, the project that is exciting to me is the Honolulu Rail Transit Project, which is supposed to open the first phase of it, not going downtown, but sort of in the western suburban areas of that city, is supposed to open later this year. And that's really exciting for me because it's kind of like the first light metro automated project in the United States. And it's going to be exciting to see whether this has appeal to other communities throughout the country, because we've seen a lot of municipalities in Europe, especially in Italy and France, develop light metros that are cheaper than like the New York style heavy rail. They have small vehicles, small stations, but they've been able to do it at a reasonable cost and provide really frequent service reliably to, their customers. And I'm excited to see whether that Honolulu project could serve as a boost for other cities looking to do something similar.
And by light metro, you mean like Skyrail in Vancouver, those types of projects, a frequent system that doesn't need a driver necessarily. They can come and go whenever, so they can boost the frequency pretty easily.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have a lot of airport people mover type things throughout the United States. I mean, from places from Atlanta to New York City. to San Francisco. We have, technologies that are similar to this with automated services that run really frequently and that are really reliable. But the extension of that technology into the regular transit sphere has remained a little far from the popular discussion. And I'm not really sure why that is. I mean, when you look at like Los Angeles's transit expansion program, it doesn't include any effort of that sort, despite the fact that other communities throughout the world, Montreal, as you said, Vancouver, and then a lot of European cities are investing in that type of technology.
Yeah, I think I rode one in Copenhagen actually
Yeah,
when we were there. Yeah.
which is the same technology as Honolulu.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that people mover thing is interesting. I think people are kind of scared of this kind of the automated guideway thing. I think people are scared of West Virginia,
The Morgantown
the
situation.
Morgantown situation, things like that. I think that's pushing people off. But as we get more and more into needing more frequency from these systems and we think about it more, I think it's probably going to take off. I think Honolulu is good, but it's also, a kind of cautionary tale. I mean, the
Hmm.
increasing expenses has been, I think, troubling. The attempts to kill it every time there's a new governor or a new mayor is frustrating, obviously. And then the rising prices and the threats by the feds to cut off money is another thing. So it's amazing that it's gotten this far. Actually, I'm pretty impressed. But yeah, we might talk about that a little later though, because of our predictions from last year. But I mean, for me, I think one of the things that was really interesting from my past and looking at what is opening this year is the Green Line in Boston.
Hmm.
The extension through Somerville. And that was actually something that when I was younger, and I guess I'm so old now, I can say when I was younger, we actually did work there looking at the price increases that would accrue to the, going through Somerville and would that
Oh,
impact
yeah.
the low
Hmm.
income neighborhoods in Somerville versus what had happened in Cambridge with the Red Line and others. And so we looked at the threeplexes and all the stuff that's happening there. And so we're like, okay, well, this line might happen in the future. And now here it is almost completed. So, one of my questions to you was if you'd actually seen the construction before you left
Absolutely.
for DC and what did it look like? And were you excited about that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the most exciting projects in the country because it serves a really dense community. I mean, Cambridge, Somerville, and Medford are suburbs of Boston, but they are quite dense. They have some of the lowest car use of any communities in the country. And the reason for that is not only their adjacency to Boston, but also the fact that, they're next to giant universities of MIT and Harvard. And you just have this huge base of people who are relying on biking and walking to get around. Cambridge has had, access to the Red Line subway, but Somerville has been really cut off from the transit system for the most part. And so the Green Line has this awesome capacity to really expand their access to downtown Boston and actually all the way throughout the region because those lines extend out into, Brookline, Newton, et cetera, on the, other side of the city. When I was there, what's remarkable is the number of new developments like housing and commercial developments that are occurring around the stations that are being built. So you have at the Cambridge Somerville line, at the current terminus of the Green Line, at Leechmere, you have a series of huge new projects that have been built and that are under construction. And then going up into Union Square in Somerville as well. You've seen a lot of development, but I know that the city has really focused on ensuring that there's a large amount of affordability as part of those projects. So I think there's a nice interplay there between transit systems, new development, and remembering that we have to keep these things affordable for people rather than creating, a system that's only affordable to wealthy people.
Yeah, I think that was the scary part from our research was that, the affordability of the places that didn't have the rail lines yet could actually get blown up just by building one because of the access that it gives to downtown. There's a lot of people that commute from those suburbs, which are in any other city, they'd probably be a part of the city of Boston,
Yeah.
but, into downtown. And so that corridor, at least the Red Line corridor, is pretty prolific when it comes to the percentage of people that are using it to get to downtown and the percentage of commuters. We often talk about mode shares and all that stuff, like 5%. And I think that Red Line jacks it up to, some large number. I'm not going to give it because I can't remember it, but it's a pretty hefty mode share on that corridor. So it stands to reason that that would happen again on the Green Line, which is really interesting. Another city that's been kind of moving slowly and steadily and going to win the race, I think, is Seattle. That's, a place I think is going to have a lot of things happening. And I appreciate that they also have, the advocates there that are pushing for the next Sound Transit expansion, even though they're not finished with the one they got. So,
Yeah.
the Seattle subway folks and all those guys and gals up there, like, pushing for that, I think that's been really impressive as well. I don't know what you've seen from Seattle and what you think about their future as a subway city.
Seattle has perhaps the most prolific, excited advocates in the transit sphere that I've ever seen, which is fantastic. So they're supposedly going to open up their Northgate Link extension of their light rail line up sort of past the University of Washington, where it currently terminates, going up into the northern suburbs. And that's just sort of the first stage of what's going to be a network that's extending north, south, east, certainly not west, given the geography.
You could go to Bainbridge, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, Seattle is facing the same major concerns of cost increase that other cities are experiencing as well. And, there's been a report out over the last few weeks that they're going to face a $10 billion gap in completing their network as planned under the last referendum, which was passed in 2016. And that means that a lot of the sort of ideas that they have for improving the network, like creating a new tunnel downtown, improving access into West Seattle, creating a new access to Ballard, those communities that really deserve better transit access may be going to have to wait significantly longer unless some new funding source comes through. So I think that Seattle is a case in point of the problem that American cities are facing, which is they're able to raise a gigantic amount of money from their residents who are excited about transit, but then the costs come in and they continue to rise over time. And that makes it very difficult to complete the projects that were promised to people. And I think that's an important issue because you promise things to voters when you ask them to vote for a transit tax initiative, right? You say to them, we will be able to pay for these set of projects with this amount of money. But if your estimates are wrong, you're essentially giving voters an incorrect understanding of what it is that they're paying for. And that is perhaps going to lead to voters being disillusioned with the goal of improving transit. I mean, we've seen that in Miami. In Miami, they passed a transit measure, I would say maybe around in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, like 2002 maybe, or 2005, something like that.
Yeah, some of that. And that was supposed to, extend subways all across the city. And I believe all they did was build a 2-mile extension of the subway to the airport. And that was it, with billions of dollars of revenue that came in. And, when you have conditions like that, people have a reason to be skeptical of the promises that you give them.
But it's a crappy double standard because nobody holds highways and roads and anything to that same standard, right?
Well, no,
like
absolutely not.
Nobody votes for roads.
No, people pay the gas tax every time they go to fill up. They don't even know they're paying the gas tax. And then the gas tax goes to pay for some highway, who knows where, that they'll probably never use, that may or may not cost the right amount. No, I mean, the situation's infinitely worse for roadways. The only reason we talk about transit is we care about it and because it's more visible because we ask people to vote for it. So I think you're right, but we can do better.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I get frustrated when we talk about having to vote for transit and then not vote for it. I mean, Austin, for example, we'll talk about Austin in a second, but Austin, for example, is up, and I know I harp on Austin a lot because I just know more about it, but like they're going to expand the freeway through downtown for $7 billion for people who don't want to be downtown, right? It's a through expansion, not a to expansion. And then they asked people to vote to pay $7 billion for a transit system. Nobody voted for that road. Nobody voted to, increase the money for gas taxes for that road, but they're going to build it when all they had to do, and I know that there's going to be people that disagree with this, but all they had to do was toll it, and then they could use that money to pay for something else. So you might not even have had to ask people for $1 billion for transit. You could have tolled the road and then spent it on transit, and then everybody would be better off. But we're spending this money here and this money there and all over the place, and it's ridiculous.
Absolutely. And, we're seeing the exact same situation in Houston, where they're bulldozing a community to expand the highway.
Yeah.
Even as the transit system is expanding, sometimes along the same right of way. I mean, that's terrible public policy. And it's two different governmental actors at cross purposes of one another. And the result is going to be disappointing for everybody.
Yeah. Well, let's go out of the United States. Obviously, I think in the past we've talked about Montreal and how they're doing some cool stuff. You mentioned it earlier. Anything outside of the United States that catches your eye?
Well, we were talking about the automated light metros like in Honolulu Montreal, Vancouver. But one new automated metro that's opening up this year is in Rennes, which is a city in Western France. And it's actually quite a small community. I think the metro area has less than 300,000 people, if I remember correctly. So it's extremely small by US standards, but this will actually be their second metro line. And it's going to be 8.8 miles of automated light metro service with a subway component, an elevated component. And to me, that's really exciting because it suggests that if you do your transportation and land use planning right, even these small communities can get really good transit and then be willing to go back and get more of it because it's working so well. I think that's something that other cities across the US should really be thinking about. I mean, why is Kansas City happy enough with a 2 mile long streetcar when it's a gigantic metropolitan area? It's not good enough for the communities that we have throughout the country. And frankly, we need to be looking at what other cities around the world are doing as examples to, really improve our transit.
I was in France in early 2019, and there were so many places that we went to, which were smaller cities and towns, 300,000, 500,000, maybe max, that all had subways through downtown. They had light rail going out to the suburbs, metros, bus rapid transit, even with dedicated right of way. So it's not even just about rail, it's about, better service and all that stuff. And they had the access to all these places. And I was amazed. I mean, I knew this because I'd read the literature, but until you go, you're like, wow, this town of of
Yeah.
small, you can walk from one side of it to the other, has a metro. What's the deal here? It feels like, Boise having a subway or something. I'm really impressed with what they've been able to do. I know it's part of that historic land use pattern, obviously, but it's also kind of regulating that so that it doesn't go out into the hinterlands, into the farmland and all that stuff. So I'm impressed with those for sure. And I think that there's so many cities that are doing that around the world. Budapest is expanding, Germany's expanding a lot of their systems and stuff, the U-bonds, et cetera. So, it's happening all over Europe and even in Asia. I mean, obviously we don't know as much about Asia because in part because of language barriers, we can't read as much about them. But in China, they're doing some serious expansion to their metro systems, and every town with they have a lot more cities, obviously, than we do with 1 million people or more, but most places with 1 million people or more, which are tens of dozens of cities, have metro lines in progress or under construction or planned. Let me ask you this. This is something that I've been thinking about for a little while. In terms of, the competitiveness of economies between the US and other countries, some of these other countries, the Chinas and the Frances and the Germanys, et cetera, they're all competing globally for economic prowess. I feel like we're going to continue to keep on falling behind if all of our money that we invest goes into spending money on housing and more expensive transportation, while these other countries are providing housing and providing transportation for their citizens. What does that mean for our economy as a whole if all of our money goes down in a hole?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think that we have an economy that's obviously premised on high rates of personal consumption. I mean, US is remarkable for having more expensive housing, more expensive transportation than almost all of our peer countries. And the result is that maybe to some degree our economy is founded on requiring people to spend all that money on housing and transportation. I mean, the average person spends what, 50% of their income on those two items alone. And, low income people spend a significantly higher share of their money on housing and transportation when you combine them. So I don't know if that actually impacts our economy as a whole because we almost create an economy that is so dependent on those things that then we get more people employed in those sectors. So I mean, as much as I wish I could say that somehow the US was going to suffer economically by being dependent on expensive housing and expensive transportation. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not an economist though, so I don't want to make any point. But one thing, here's what I do think, Jeff. I think that I think that the choices we have made in the United States, which is primarily to focus our investments on highways, primarily to encourage people to live in single family homes that are quite expensive. Those choices as public policies and as private investment choices have been ones that have the tendency to create massive inequalities within our regions or to the detriment of significant areas of our cities. Compared to other areas of the sort of wealthy world, the US has far more areas of its metropolitan areas that are just completely disinvested, have extremely low incomes, that are very segregated, that have inadequate transportation and degraded public services. And that occurs because of the fact that we allow our metropolitan regions to sprawl out, have automobile dominance everywhere, and rely on single family homes. And that is to the detriment of a more equitable society. And that's where I think the choices we make in the US about transportation land use really have negative consequences. I think it's in that achievement of a more equitable society.
I'd agree with that. We'll table that. I want to think about that a bit more. And I think we should come back and talk about it in the future because I think it's an interesting topic to think about what that means from a international, national perspective and the economy. Okay, so let's get into the predictions, shall we?
Sure.
From last year. You excited
No,
to
I
hear?
don't. I don't want to know.
Well, we're going to have to find out sometime. Actually, I will say before we start that we did pretty well. We did pretty well. Yeah.
Despite COVID.
Despite COVID. This first one might be our negative, but it is COVID. The new downtown Miami link for Tri-Rail will get more discussion. That was your first one.
I don't think anybody has talked about it. I nobody has talked about it. No, I think it's been under discussed, partially because it hasn't opened yet. But I think also it's worth pointing out that the Rail project, the sort of expansion of intercity rail in Florida, has actually taken strides forward. And it continues apparently to take strides despite all concerns that it was going to sort of fall apart because of the financing being quite questionable with relationship to actual passenger numbers. I mean, they're talking already about extending the line from Orlando to Disney World and then maybe to Tampa. And those expansions are being premised along the idea that they will include some commuter rail improvements. I mean, in the Miami area, you have, yes, the Tri-Rail service hopefully going to access downtown Miami soon, but also a new line, the commuter rail line that would use the Brightwell right-of-way up along the sort of coast. And then in Orlando, you have Brightline trying to negotiate with the Orlando Commuter Rail Authority to try to get service down to Disney World. So I think that those are both really positive changes. Have I been calling it Bright Rail? I meant Brightline.
People know what it is. Brightline. And it is Brightline because they recently got rid of Virgin as their kind of naming sponsor, and now they're in a lawsuit with each other about that. So that's
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, this happened in like the last couple of days I saw an article about it. So it's pretty new. But yes, it's Brightline. And you convinced me into 2 out of 4 stars for that one because I was going to give you 0, but
yes,
you convinced me to 2 out of 4 stars for that one. Okay, so the next one is both of us predicted that Austin will finally pass its light rail package.
And we were right.
You agreed with me on that one. So here we are. And they passed it by a significant amount too. It wasn't just a squeaker or a nail biter. It was a good amount. So now they're going to get started.
So Jeff, this is where I want to hear from you.
Okay.
What made this package that passed in 2020 so different from the others that have been put forward to Austin voters? Or has the city of Austin changed to catch up with this idea? Or is it both?
I think I mentioned last year, part of it is migration, but not the migration that you might think. Everybody's spoiling on Californians and things like that coming into Texas and doing that. But most of the migration in Texas is actually coming from metropolitan areas in Texas. So Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, et cetera. So a lot of people are moving to Austin, but they're from these other cities. But I think if they're moving to Austin, they might be a little bit more left-leaning. And still there's right-leaning people moving there too. But maybe the averages are leaning more left. There are some Californians, obviously, and some people from other states, but Elon Musk and Joe Rogan don't make a whole huge migration. It's just not, in the numbers that we're seeing. So I think that's a small part of it. But another part of it is that they gave him a package that was good that they, people could vote for. You gave them a system of lines that could possibly reach most people. You weren't fighting with South Congress merchants like you were in 2000. You weren't proposing lines that wouldn't really go into the densest parts of the city. They made progress on talking about building a network that actually, I think, worked for the most people. And so I think that's why. There's a number of different reasons. The opposition could have gone totally all Nashville on them, but they didn't, and we got a result. So I'm actually happy with it. I was happy with it beforehand. I wasn't super happy with the last election and the alignment and all those things. And I think a lot of people shared that sentiment. So finally, they got something that people wanted to vote for. And I think that's the key. And now we have that other issue that we talked about earlier with the freeway that's being expanded where you could toll it and get even more money for transit, maybe build a whole subway instead of a partial subway through downtown. But, I think it's going to be a boon for the city. especially along the Guadalupe corridor where 200,000 people go to school, live, and work. It's a dense core. It's going to really do well. And yeah, I'm excited. And now if they can keep it on time, on budget, that would be even better.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting about Austin is that there's this focus on creating a service that is really about the most urban part of the region. And this is very different from the sort of regional rail commuter rail service, the Red Line, that they opened a few years ago, which is very sort of like focused on the suburbs, doesn't even really enter the downtown. And so there's sort of a radical change in the philosophy about what the point of transit is.
Yeah. I should say also, it's not just about the lines. It was about the service that they were going to provide, the bus expansion. And it wasn't just two rail lines that people were voting on. It was a whole package of transit and access. So I think that's a,
And there was funding for affordable housing.
yeah, then they made some deals along the corridor for, making some funding available for thinking about TOD and, displacement and those types of things. That probably helped people vote for it as well. Okay, next up, Yonah Freemark says, Honolulu's first line will not open this year and will be delayed. That's what you said last.
Well, I was right. I was right. My favorite project continues to be delayed. Yeah, I mean, I believe it's going to open in 2021. I am convinced that it will open in 2021. But do I have the right to make a projection about this year?
Yeah, you can make a projection. Yeah, projection for next year. So 2021 for that one.
Yeah.
It's interesting. That project got pushed back. The Central Subway here in San Francisco got pushed back again. All these projects keep getting pushed. So I think we'll do pretty well if we continue to predict that projects will get pushed back.
Did we have the Washington Silver Line extension project on our list?
Not on this year. We might have had it in the previous years.
Yeah, because, well, that was supposed to open in 2021, and they've already announced it's delayed to 2022.
That's the one at the airport, right?
Yeah. Which I was excited about using when in a future world where the coronavirus allows me to travel.
Yeah, I know. Well, you'll get there. We'll get vaccines and we'll get going. I think it'll be positive. Watch out for your plane emissions, though. That's the only thing. That's what I'm worried about.
True.
I do love travel, but I also like the planet as well. Okay. You also said we need to manage project construction better, which I'll give you an extra bonus point for that because you talked about that last year too. And then we pivoted last year and we started talking instead of not just about transportation, but about housing. And I think when we talked, it was right after SB 50 kind of crashed and burned. And so your prediction was there will be a major housing bill passed in this session in California. It's not going to have the scale or ambition of SB 50, but you thought it would pass. And I will say I'll give you 3 out of 4 points because technically it did pass, but it got stuck between the Assembly and the Senate at midnight. And so it didn't actually pass.
I also think that the pandemic has made a lot of legislative action like that get delayed. I mean, we have an interesting situation where a lot of the pressing concerns of pre-pandemic life no longer seem as top of the hour. In terms of housing affordability, I mean, San Francisco is much cheaper than it was a year ago. Whether that's a temporary trend is unclear.
Still not that cheap, but yes, cheaper. I mean,
right.
The fire was way too hot and now we're just kind of like, we're still scorching things. It's just not burning them immediately.
Yeah. I mean, I do think one thing that's been interesting to look at in DC is that rental prices appear to have dropped quite significantly, especially in terms of giving people deals. People get like a few months off.
There was that in San Francisco in the middle of the year last year too. That was yeah.
But like house prices have actually gone up. People still want to buy in urban centers. So that suggests to me that we need to come back to these housing affordability issues, again, also including around transit, which is going to continue to be, I believe, very valuable for people throughout our communities. These issues are going to come back. California will be passing more housing related bills.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so that's the predictions that we did pretty well. I'm going to say, we basically got 3 out of 4, which is a pretty good.
That's very, very sort of a silver lining approach to this.
This year was crap, right? So, the last 12 months were crap. So I'm just going to give it to us. I'm more than happy to do that.
It's good policy.
Okay, so because of the pandemic, I don't think that there are major transit elections coming, and I'm not sure about what's opening and what's not opening. I think everything's kind of up in the air.
Well, just quickly, I mean, I do think that we might see an election coming up in Charlotte.
Oh, that's right.
So this could be maybe the one major city exception. And the reason for that is that they want to build a new sort of east-west line that would serve the airport to the west and I believe Independence Boulevard to the east, sort of southeast.
Yes.
So
I think that's their silver line, or was their silver line maybe at some point.
yeah. So I think they want to move forward with that project. There's a lot of excitement. I personally am from North Carolina. It was very disappointing to see the Durham Chapel Hill light rail project fall apart last year. So it would be nice to see some progress in North Carolina.
Right. Yeah, you kind of got burned by that one last year. Okay.
Yeah.
Independence Boulevard, freight right of way or freeway? He's shaking his head. For the audio listeners out there, he's shaking his head.
I don't know. This is another one of these projects where you really ask, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but should the city and the county be focusing its limited transit funding on projects that are going to be in areas that are not super oriented towards pedestrian, either the freight corridor or the highway corridor? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. When they first passed their ballot measure, I think it was like 2006, they built a light rail line with it, but they also provided money to boost transit funding for service. And they boosted their ridership, I think 100% just by doing that. So, imagine what they could do if they boosted the bus funding again versus maybe extending along that corridor, which when I was younger, I might have been more excited about it. But if it's a choice between a freight right of way and a freeway right of way and nothing in between, maybe that's not the way to go. And commute patterns as they are, because of the pandemic, maybe we had to switch to thinking about more core service for people that live in denser areas and serve them and get their VMT down rather than focusing on these commute trips that may or may not happen because of commuting. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah. I do think, Charlotte's interesting because their first line, the blue line, goes directly through downtown and it goes to their sort of densest near downtown neighborhood, the South End. And now it extends up to the university. And I think those are all really good choices in terms of where you want to send transit. So, they've made some good choices there and, perhaps they'll make good choices in the future.
Yeah. And they got a little lucky because their freight corridor, the South End, there's a lot of textile mills and stuff that they could redevelop. And that line was actually going directly parallel to their major boulevard, which was helpful as well. So they got a little lucky there, which is, good decision to do that. You have to watch out for that stuff when you're trying to think about expanding lines. And they're also thinking about, getting rid of single family zoning, but that's kind of getting a lot of pushback now. If you've been reading the Charlotte Observer in the last couple of days, that's been a big thing. And I think the planning director said, well, we're not necessarily getting rid of single family neighborhoods. And I kind of like put a pawn to my forehead. So we'll see what happens. I'm interested in that movement across the country too. That's another discussion that we'll take a whole other podcast to talk about. But okay, let's talk about our predictions for this year. So you're saying Charlotte will have an election this year?
No. I hope not, at least, because it's bad to have these elections on off years, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. So in the next 2 years, Charlotte will have an election.
It seems like it, yeah. It seems like they're moving that direction.
Okay, I'll take that bet. I don't know what we're winning, but we're taking that bet.
I think that Gwinnett County, Georgia, which had a very, very tight transit election in November, will try to do another one in 2022. That's my prediction.
Okay. Yeah, they lost their transit election by a very slim margin.
Yeah.
Although, if we can't pass HR 1, the voter restrictions might dampen that ability a little bit to do that. So let's let more people vote. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, so Charlotte and Gwinnett County, I'm changing the game a little bit this year because of the pandemic. And with a once in a lifetime or once in a generation infrastructure bill coming up, I want to get our predictions for that because I think that that's going to be kind of the big touch point come next year. I think it might get done, but we'll see. But I want to hear your predictions about what will be in the infrastructure bill. They could be crazy. They can be fantastical. They can be anything. And next year we'll be like laughing about whether it was right or wrong or not.
That's fair. What's interesting about the infrastructure bill this year is that it is in the middle of a sort of massive group of interested bodies. I was sort of writing down all the different people who would be involved. So you have the president, Joe Biden, who's obviously excited about infrastructure, has been talking about infrastructure his entire life. He really wants to do this big piece of legislation. You have Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who says he wants an infrastructure legislation, but also wants Republican cooperation and also wants it to be paid for through something that is not going to increase the size of the deficit, which likely means increasing taxes. So that seems very difficult to reconcile starting out. Then you have three separate Senate committees all involved in the creation of transportation legislation. And then you have the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is also involved. And then, of course, you have many different, interested parties who have ideas about the way this infrastructure bill is going to work. So, we're walking into this very interesting environment where you have lots of people excited about doing something about infrastructure, which could mean a lot of things, and a lot of high expectations that, the Obama administration wasn't really able to do ever a major infrastructure bill as part of its, 2 terms. So I think that my prediction is that there's going to be an infrastructure bill this year. That's sort of my general prediction. And I do think it's going to be a significant expansion over the current transportation authorization, which is set to expire, I believe, in October. And so my prediction is that it will increase transit funding quite spectacularly and Amtrak funding by even more. So the reason why I think that is that the Moving Forward Act, which was the bill passed by the House last year to provide reauthorization of transportation funding, would have tripled funding for Amtrak and massively increased the amount of money we were spending on transit construction. So like new transit projects. And what's been interesting is that you've seen over the last few weeks, a lot of the top Democrats who run those 3 committees, so we're talking about Tom Carper, Maria Cantwell, and Sherrod Brown, all saying they want to significantly increase funding for transit. And ultimately, they're the ones who are going to be pushing the message. And I think that the way they're going to do it is by repealing some of the Trump tax cuts. And so that will give Senator Manchin his ability to claim that this is being done in a sort of deficit neutral way. And it will be done in a way that Democrats are okay with because they are not really in favor of the Trump tax cuts. And it will be done in a way that can at least sort of appeal to some Republicans. I still think, though, it would only be passed, if it passed at all, with 51 votes, with, the 50 Democrats and the vice president.
Interesting. You're going the reality-based way. I like it.
Yeah, I'm going reality-based. I could also say that we're going to agree to spend $1 trillion on a high-speed rail network.
Okay. Oh, that's real. That's a real prediction there. I like that. $1 trillion on a high-speed rail network. Okay. Let me give you my reality-based stuff first, and then I'll go fantastical.
Okay.
So I think we'll actually finally get rid of the 80-20 split. And I think this is going towards your discussion of increased transit funding. Streets Blog Chicago reported that Chuy Garcia, who's a representative in Illinois, wants transit parity. So, he's introduced bills to increase funding fourfold for transit. So I think that's going to be something that happens. So it's not necessarily an 80-20 split where you're reapportioning money from the freeways. It's going to be a more money for transit, which makes the percentages change, which I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of because I don't think we necessarily need to spend more money on freeways. But if we get more transit funding, then I think that that's probably a positive. So I'm going to say that. The second one I think that I was thinking about was, Secretary Pete has been going around talking about all these great things, equity. He's been talking about the environment. He's been talking about MUTCD stuff, all this stuff. He's been going around talking about the things we all care about. But one thing that he mentioned at the City Lab forum last week was the idea of fix it first, which I think is something that obviously T for America has been pushing. Obviously, it's something that we all care about so much because we're tired of expansions and not fixing the roads and bridges that need to be fixed already. So I think a major focus of the bill will be fix it first. And so getting that funding for the backlog of just fixing even transit projects. I mean, Chicago has been doing this massive rebuild of some of their lines that's been taking up a lot of the money, which has been in some of the funding. There's funding buckets for that. But I think there's going to be even more money for fixing up all of these lines. New York City subways, they need more elevators. They need more access for disabilities. BART in San Francisco needs more access as well. All these retrofits and things like that. I think that's going to be a big component of the bill. And then also we need to spend money on electrifying the fleets, bus fleets, doing all that stuff. So I think that's going to be a major component. So on my fantastical side, I'm going to say that the bill is going to include money in some form or fashion for operating,
Yeah.
which has never happened before. And so I think that's kind of a long shot. My preference would be for something along the lines of, and I've mentioned this on the show a couple of times, but here in the Bay Area, obviously we have 29 transit agencies. They all kind of fiefdoms upon themselves. And whenever somebody transfers, they have to pay a new fee. So if you take away that fee from them to try to make it quote unquote seamless, they get upset because they feel like they'll be losing revenue. If the feds can backfill that for all agencies around the country where they decide to make things more seamless, I think that would be a huge win. Make it easier to get from New Jersey Transit to New York City Subway, make it easier to get from BART to Caltran, et cetera. Make that easier through backfilling that through the federal bill. I would be all about that. And my final one, this is my super fantastical one, is that we're going to stop talking about the gas tax. We're going to stop talking about, using just general funds, and we're going to fund it all with a carbon tax.
Oh, wow. Okay. I was with you until that last moment. It's not that I'm against a carbon tax. It just there's something that we haven't quite developed I'm not sensing the excitement in Washington about a carbon tax.
Maybe not excitement, but there's a discussion about it.
Discussion, yeah.
And even the petroleum folks are talking about carbon taxes now. And that's the signal to me that it might actually be doable. Now, whether the way they want to do it is going to be agreeable between both sides, that's probably the sticking point. But if you get, I think it was the American Petroleum Institute or somebody along those lines that was talking about carbon taxes that have never talked about that before and have always kind of, been like, that's crazy talk. You also had a meeting between Biden and some business leaders around the country trying to get their gauge there. It was on CNBC, some article a couple of weeks ago. And then you have Secretary Pete saying, we're not touching the gas tax. We're not touching some of this other stuff. And so it leads me to crazy places when I start to kind of pull that stuff together in my mind, like I'm looking at a crime scene.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know. We'll have to see. That's your crazy.
That's my crazy prediction. I'm not going to guarantee it at all. I'm just saying I'd like it to happen.
I do think this question of operating funding is really interesting. I mean, so to clarify, obviously, it's worth pointing out that the federal government does pre-pandemic. It was paying for the operating support of some agencies that were small.
Small agencies, yes.
Yeah. And it wasn't paying for the operating, of the big agencies that carry the vast majority of people,
right.
BART, MTA, et cetera. So, from a technical perspective, expanding acceptable use of federal funding to operating, I think actually would be quite easy. You would just have to change the applicability criteria to say that actually any system can use their federal formula funds for operations. I think the question for us to consider is how much money would the federal government have to increase in its support for transit to make that kind of agreement reasonable? In other words, let's say today the federal government agreed to allow all agencies to use existing transit funding for operating support, not just capital funding, for maintenance, bus purchasing, et cetera. The result might be that a lot of agencies would forego capital investments and instead use it to improve service, which I think is probably a good thing in the short term. But over the long term, you start to worry that, okay, maybe people are not, getting the improvement in buses. Maybe the facilities themselves are starting to break down a little more than they used to. So I guess my question is, what is the amount of increase we need at the federal level to be able to pay for both existing capital expenditures and also that improvement in operating support?
Well, I think you need a bucket of money creating a new formula fund of some sort in its own world, because I don't think you can allow agencies to forego capital improvements or repairs, because that's going to be something that people are going to be frustrated by when their buses start breaking down. Although, if they're going to make a major capital outlay on new infrastructure, they might be able to, like, electric buses and things like that have a 15 to 30 year lifespan. If you have a 15-year window where you've bought everybody new buses, you might have a little bit of a window there where you can, you give them the capital funding to buy this new equipment, but then you have this 15 years of operating kind of that's necessary to keep those going. And then you kind of have to re-up that every 15 years or so, or every, 10 years or so when the capital for those buses runs out. But I think you need to make a bucket for access, and not just for funding operations necessarily, but all these agencies that have been redoing their bus network plans, that have been thinking hard about how to get more ridership. I think there needs to be some sort of planning mechanism in there that where you make a plan to actually expand your ridership, to make sure that you hit those targets, whatever they may be. I think we need to make it data driven. I think we need to make sure that we follow all the things related to equity, et cetera. We need to do stuff like, mapping where the environmental impacts are, especially environmental justice issues. And if we have a target for all those things that we need and make it access driven, so we make sure we focus on getting people to work, to food, to jobs, et cetera, however that might work. But you make a pot and say, okay, we're going to have in this pot is going to be planning funding for you to make an access plan that's over and above what you have to do for your long-term transportation plan. And then you can get funding based on that plan and how well it's executed. So you can have operations funding for that. If this project here is going to allow this to happen, then you get money for that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit more prescriptive, but it's also a little bit more open, because I think that it will give cities and states and rural areas the ability to have service and not be so prescriptive that it's requiring that this small rural town has to buy a couple of buses when maybe they just need some van pools or something like that. It can be up to everybody's individually. One of the things that's been frustrating to me, and I talked about this on the Monday show this week, is that the Republicans that are in the House on the committees, they have been saying, okay, this bill needs to be only roads and bridges and nothing else, because they feel like it's going to be, they're kind of bastardizing the term equity. It's really frustrating the way that they talk about it, but they say that it's going to be inequitable to rural areas. Well, my thing is that if you design the program correctly, it will be available for rural areas, for urban areas, and make sure that it's a metric that you can actually make real. So I think that access metric, whatever it may be, if you can create an equitable access metric, that means getting people from low income neighborhoods to jobs and things like that, that improves economies. I think you can design the system so that it works for everybody, and then everybody can get on board, and not just make these kind of overarching claims that it's not going to be equitable because it's going to be focused on urban areas, which I want access for everybody. I'm not urban versus rural or anything like that. I just want to make sure people have access.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating idea. This concept of saying every community needs to be developing plans around how to achieve more equitable access, urban, rural, wherever. And then the federal government needs to step in and help communities achieve that. One thing that comes to mind is the Obama administration's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which was all about, combating segregation, improving equity in housing.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder, are there possibilities to create similar requirements for transit systems? I mean, can we ask metropolitan areas throughout the country to develop affirmatively furthering fair transit to make sure that everyone throughout their communities has access to reliable, frequent public transit options? I think that is a doable idea, and it's something that we really need to see, because outside of the dense urban areas with a lot of transit, like San Francisco, Washington, New York, you have a lot of urban areas in the country with a lot of low income people who have really terrible transit service, and they need better access. And then you have rural areas that are completely deprived of that entirely. I think if the federal government said, you need to start planning for redressing these issues, and then we're going to pay for the operations to make it possible, that to me that's the agenda Jeff and Yonah can stand for.
All right. So that's our prediction for next year. That's going to happen. I guess we need to call some people. I'll get on the phone right away and call my people, whoever that might be. I don't know. Maybe some of you are listening as well. Yeah, so that's good. I like those predictions. I'm all on board. I think we did well with some basic ones and fantastical ones. I'm good at generally at knowing the committees in the Senate and the House and all that stuff that deal with this stuff. But you said 3 in the Senate, and I can't remember the third one, and it's driving me crazy. T&I, Transportation Infrastructure, Environment and Public Works. What's the third one?
Well, so Transportation Infrastructure is the House committee, and then in the Senate we have, and I wrote this down to clarify. Okay, so
no, you should have said it. This is off the top of my head.
Yeah, so we have Environment and Public Works, which supervises the highway programs in the public works. And that's chaired by Tom Carper of Delaware. And the reason why this is important to transit is that actually highway programs often allow flexibility. They allow, multimodal access. All those things are included in the highway program. So that's one committee. Another committee is the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee.
Yep.
That's chaired by Sherrod Brown, and that oversees urban mass transit and the Federal Transit Administration. And then you have Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which is chaired by Maria Cantwell of Washington, which oversees the Federal Railroad Administration, Amtrak, as well as some other organizations like the Surface Transportation Board. So you have all these different committees, many senators, all with their hands in the pot. And I tell you what, they're bringing back earmarks this year. I have no doubt this legislation, if they can, is going to be chock full with projects that each of these senators and House members want to get for their community.
Okay, so we got Peter DeFazio on TNI, Tom Carper, EPW, Sherrod Brown on banking, and then on commerce, Maria Cantwell. I can see some Seattle subway stuff coming from that. I can see some more Portland funding coming in there for Oregon and for maybe Eugene, which is where Peter's from. Lots of stuff going on. Okay, that's good. Good to know. Those are the people that are going to be controlling the discussions in those committees. Let's talk to them about access.
Yeah. Call your senator, even if they're not your senator specifically.
That's right.
Because they still make decisions.
And Tom Carper, I mean, he's written some really great bills around TOD and things like that too. So he's been doing this for a while as well. So I don't know as much about Sherrod Brown, but the other three, I know that they've been big on this for a while. So
yeah, I think Carper's quite progressive on transportation matters, which is why the fact that he oversees the committee that deals with highway issues is actually really important, right? Because the Highway Administration, which is now potentially going to play a big role in the overall administration's climate program, is really important for the transit program.
Yeah. Well, Yonah, I want to be mindful of your time. We've been talking for at least an hour now. And so this is going to be a long episode, but I think it's very informative. As always, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. Thank you many, many times.
No, thank you. It's always fun.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web, theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.